For many of us, we are passive in our relationship with Jesus Christ. That God calls us into things and we just hang back a little bit too apathetic and oftentimes hiding behind Christian cliches. God is a God that loves action. God wants us to be forthright in our relationship with Him and on the journey that He has called us into. And that's specifically what we're going to be talking about here in part 3 of the journey. And if you find this to be a helpful teaching, one of the things that helps us to know it's connecting for you is that if you like and subscribe to our channel. So thanks so much for tuning in. Let's jump into today's episode. When you're talking about the journey, one of the best stories to look at in the Bible is the Israelites' journey out of Egypt. God has just rescued and redeemed them from their slavery, and they are on their way to the desert. And in chapter 13 of Exodus, we read this. And they moved on from Sukkot and encamped at Etam on the edge of the desert. Now, when it says on the edge of the desert, it literally means on the edge of the desert. So on a map here, we've got some locations that we're certain of, and then other locations recorded in the scriptures that we're not entirely sure of, but we're in the right vicinity. And so they come to Etam, and they are moving out of the Goshen region. Now, Goshen is one of the most lush areas you will ever see. It is got the dark, brown, rich soil, beautiful greenery everywhere. I mean, it is spectacular in the Goshen area. And then you leave Goshen, and when you enter into the desert, you literally go in to this. It is that stark, it is that much of a contrast, and the change happens incredibly quick. How quick? Like that quick right there. You move from this green into the brown, and it is stark. From this to this, or you could say from what is known to what is unknown. We talk about these desert times in our lives as being a time where we don't know what's going on. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know where we're going. And that was true for the people in Egypt as well. They didn't typically travel out into the desert. They stayed within the confines of the greenery, which was up in Goshen, and then what came along the side of the Nile River down through the heartland of Egypt. And so when we read that they come to the edge of the desert, that's exactly where they are. They're at the precipice, if you will, of leaving what is known into what is unknown. And so the very next verse makes sense for us in light of the fact that the Israelites are going to need guidance as they're moving into the unknown. So we read that by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So God is leading Israel in this way into the unknown, into the vast desert landscape. And then when you dip into chapter 14, you find that they were at Etam, and now they're moving deeper now into the desert, and they're following the cloud, and essentially the cloud does a U-turn. And for the Israelites, they're like, what in the world is going on here? Now, as the reader, we are privy to the fact that God is doing this in order to get the Egyptians to think that the Israelites are lost, which is going to allow the Egyptians to pursue the Israelites, and then God is going to take care of the Egyptians. But the Israelites, they don't get that insider information. They are going, what in the world is going on? And then they get hemmed in, if you will, within the desert. And all of a sudden they look over the western horizon and the Egyptian army comes after them. And they are freaking out and they go after Moses. I mean, they just lambast him. Were there no graves in Egypt? Like, why did you bring us out here into the desert to die? They are angry, they are upset, and they're letting Moses have it. And so then in the midst of all of this, we read in chapter 14 of verse 13 and 14, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Now that's interesting because the words that get translated into English as "be still" is from one Hebrew word. It's the word charash, and it means to be silent, to keep still, but it also means to do nothing, like to remain inactive. And so Moses is saying to the people, like, just watch, God is going to do something spectacular, and he's right on that front. But then he says, you only need to be still, do nothing. And then notice the very next thing that we see, what God says to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." Moses says, all you got to do is nothing. And God's like, Moses, what are you saying to them? Tell them to get moving. And it's this moment right here that I think speaks into a larger issue of how we relate to God on the journey of life and where we often get hung up. And I would just kind of summarize it this way, that for many of us, we live by this notion that you don't go until God says so. I hear this all the time. I'm just waiting on God. I'm just waiting for God to show me what to do. And there's this very kind of passive nature to it. Now, I don't want to discredit this because there have indeed been times in my life where I felt like God has said to me, like, Brad, I don't want you to do anything in this situation. Like, I need you to be still. Do nothing. Wait for me to tell you to go. So this is biblical, and it does happen from time to time. But what I have found in my own experience is that God interacting with me this way is very far and few between. That this is not only in my journey, but what I have found with others on their journey as well, is that God at times may do this, but more often than not in the scriptures, God isn't about don't go until God says so. It's more along the lines of go until God says no. It's like God says, hey, get going. I'll meet you on the road. Get moving. And for many of us, we kind of hide behind the don't go until God says so because what we're waiting for is all of the details, all of the information. What's the itinerary? Is this thing going to be safe? Is it going to be successful? So I'm not going to go until God gives me all of that. And I think more often than not, I think God's perspective is go until I say no. Let me work with you on your journey, but get going. Give me something to work with. God says to Moses, tell the Israelites to move on. Get to where I need you to go. Because I think for many of us, when we get stuck, when we feel hemmed in, there are these moments where we're like, God, I just want you to part the sea for me. Clearly articulate where you want me to go. And I think there are many times where God goes, I do want to part the sea for you. The problem is you got to get there first. You got to get to the sea in order for me to part it, to then show you where you need to go. A number of years ago, a good friend of mine, George DeYoung, just said, Brad, really what this is all about is give God something to bless. Give God something to work with. and allow God to work in the midst of what you are giving Him. That you go and you let God direct the path. There are times where I'm not entirely sure where to go, but it's like, okay, I'm going to start moving and I'm going to go, God, is this what you want? And a no here means, okay, I'm not supposed to go that way. I need to go this direction, or I need to try this. And God's saying, just give me something to work with and I'll work with what you give me. Oftentimes I think that we hide behind these Christian cliches in our lives. That when we're stuck and when we're kind of waiting on God, it's like we may try something and it doesn't work out and we go, well, I guess that's just not God's will for me. Or probably the big one that we've all heard a plethora of times is we say things like, well, if one door closes, another one is going to open. Or another version of this is, well, if one door closes, God's going to provide a window. I don't understand that. You can see through windows. Like, how does that connect with a door? But it's this idea that when things happen, if we're trying something and something isn't working and we go, well, that door closed, we oftentimes assume God was the one who closed the door. So we step back and go, well, if God closed this door, He's going to open another door for me. A number of years ago, I heard Erwin McManus talking about this cliche. And I remember him saying very clearly, he says, did it ever occur to you that maybe God didn't close that door? And that you need to get a running start and kick the door down? It's a much more active way of engaging with the journey. And what I have found is that oftentimes when I think God has closed a door, when I've gotten a running start and tried to beat down the door actually opened. It went down. It was, oh, that wasn't God who was closing that door. There was something that was getting in the way because this thing is important. Now, there are other times where I've gotten a running start and I've hit that door and that door didn't budge. And it was like, you know what? If I could go around the backside, it's bolted in 8 different places. God was clearly saying this was not where you're supposed to go. Go somewhere else. But what we don't want to do on the journey in giving God something to bless is just hide behind these Christian cliches without recognizing that God wants us to be active, not passive, on the journey of life. Let's give God something to bless. It was about 5 or 6 years ago or so. A guy contacted me and said, hey, I really want to go on your Israel trip. And I was like, fantastic, would love to have you. What's the problem? He says, I don't have the money to go. And I was like, oh, okay. But he said, I believe God wants me to go on this trip. And so I'm going to be praying that God provides for me in order to go on this trip. And I was like, that's a really good thing to do. And so a few weeks went by, didn't hear anything. A couple months went by, didn't hear anything. And then all of a sudden I got a call out of the blue one day from this guy, and I picked it up and he just said, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I don't think it's God's will for me to go on this trip. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, I just don't have the money to be able to go. I got about half of the trip covered, but the other half I don't have, and I just don't think that I'm supposed to go on this trip. And I said to him, I said, did you say no? Or did God clearly say no? He goes, what do you mean? I said, did God tell you no to this trip, or are you saying no just because you don't have the money? He said, well, I don't really feel like there's a moment where God said I'm not supposed to go, but I don't have the money. I said, what are you doing to give God something to bless? He's like, what do you mean? And I explained this concept to him about Moses and the Israelites being at the sea and how God is saying, get moving. I do want to do something for you, but you got to give me something to work with. I want you to give me something to work with. And so I walked him through this. And what we found out is that he hadn't explored all of his options as it was relating to fundraising. And so we talked through some different options and ideas. And about a week went by and I got a call. And I picked up and he said, Brad, God wants me on this trip. And I go, then what happened? He said, well, I just gave God something to bless. I started talking to a few people. I started sharing the story. And a guy that I do not know heard about my story and my longing to go to Israel. And he contacted me and he just said, hey, how about I cover half your trip to be able to go? He didn't even know that I needed half in order to go. He was just led to say, I'll give you half for your trip. And it was a lesson that changed the trajectory of his life. God met him in an amazing way on the Israel trip. He went on to seminary. He went on to study at Jerusalem University College in Israel. And this guy's got a bright, bright future because he gave God something to bless. He didn't live by the notion of, well, I'm just not going to go until God says so, or I'm just going to kind of just passively, wait, and if things don't work out, I'll just assume that that's not God's will. Is that he went until God said no, and God didn't say no, but he thought that he had, because he hadn't really explored what it means to give God something to bless. And this is a huge thing for us as we're on the journey of life. And so for you, what does this look like to give God something to bless? Maybe for you right now, in the midst of the tail end here of COVID and still all of the problems with the workforce and not having a job, and maybe you're looking for a job right now and you've already interviewed 5 times and you go, I'm not getting any jobs. Listen, you may be another 7 interviews away from getting the job that God wants to give you, but you got to go through those other 6 in order to get to that 7th. And maybe for some of you, you have been trying to determine, I've got a passion for this particular area, but I don't know what it looks like to move into this area. The question becomes, if you're wanting to explore something, can you volunteer in this? Can you get a better sense? Is this something that you would want to do, that this is what God is leading you to? If God has put a passion in your heart to be part of this thing over here, and you're going, okay, I just don't know what all the details look like. I don't understand how all this will work out. It's as we talked in our last episode, what's the next right step? How can you give God something to bless in order for him to say, yes, this is the right direction, or no, this isn't, or let's just move it this way, and provide you with an understanding of where you need to go next. All of that is part of giving God something to bless on the journey of life. So don't wait for God to say go unless God has clearly said, I don't want you to go. Go until God says no. Give him something to bless. And I believe that you will find that more opportunities will open because you're giving God something to work with than if you just sit back waiting for God to manufacture everything that you want. Because God is a God of the journey, not the destination. And he wants to form and shape us on the journey. And when we walk in trust, when we lead with trust and we give God something to work with, God often does things that surprise us because we gave him something to bless. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And may you walk out the text well in your life.